All right, everybody. So today we are doing a little bit different. We're going to do a Q&A style, and I have Abel Csabai with us. How you doing, man?
I am good, pretty good. Um, yeah, except for the little thing with my wrist, which
Yeah.
is nothing serious, but it looks serious. Apart from that, all good.
Yeah, so like we were discussing, a lot of people send us questions on Instagram or in the comments and stuff, and I figured, I don't know if I'm going to do like a weekly Q&A, but if you guys like the idea, comment down below either with questions or just that you like the idea, and maybe I can make it a more regular thing. So we're just going to kind of go into that now.
hmm
So one is it's not actually just a specific question, but a comment that Abel and I kind of discussed a little bit, and that is the idea of like coaching and coaching costs. Because I had, and I won't say the person's name, and we had a very friendly conversation. So if he's listening to this, what's up? But it was basically just on the idea of coaching, and I had asked them what they had thought was like a reasonable cost, and they had set a certain amount, and I just thought it was interesting because I think back to like when I was in high school. Okay. So I was in high school working, at a restaurant and I was making, obviously like not a lot of money, but it was important enough for me to hire a coach. And this is something I was super passionate about and also something I was very knowledgeable on even at that time. But it was important enough for me and the goals I had to hire somebody. And at the time, I think it was something like, I want to say $100. I could go back and check. It was like maybe $100 per month, maybe $150 per month. And this was again 2008, and I was paying my own money again as like a 17-year-old. Okay. And so sometimes I find it interesting because I'll see some people who charge really absurd amounts. And I say absurd like it's very high amounts, not that they shouldn't charge it. I think, it's fine to charge what people will pay. And if you aren't comfortable charging that much, then don't. But if people are paying for it, like we could even discuss like Greg Doucette's insane prices. They're astronomically high. I find it ludicrous to pay that much to talk to Greg, but I also don't fault him for doing it. If he actually is getting people to pay for that, same thing with Derek for more plates, more dates. If you're going to pay $700 for a half an hour consult, that's great. I
A
wouldn't charge him
thousand.
to it. Is that what it is now? I mean, that seems nuts to me, but hey, it is what it is. But um, I think you have to consider having, this is why I don't even do like family members for free anymore. Because I used to, and nobody stuck with it. So if you have a goal that's actually really important to you, you should consider what is that worth. So I mean, I'm not going to say my or Abel's fees here, but I think they're actually very reasonable fees, and they're not also like that private. I mean, if you want to know, just send me an email. But I think you have to consider what you're getting out of it. And something that this person said is, well, I know you have another job, so I thought you'd have cheaper fees, which to me is actually kind of the opposite. So for
Yeah.
people who know, I do most of what I do is dental surgery. I make a very good living doing that. So if I'm doing that for 40 hours a week, you have to consider that I'm then only going to take a few select clients. I don't have a roster of 50 clients. I might have, 5 to 10, maybe a little bit more clients at a time because I really value the relationships with the clients. Some of these clients I've had coming up on a year. Some, I mean, I've been helping for a long time. And that's some of them more casually. But the point is, it's time away from something else where I could be making way more money. So I enjoy it a lot. And I really like to see people progress over time. But there's a significant investment from a coach. And when you consider like unlimited messaging and what we do, I just think it's important to consider that when you hire a coach and what you're willing to invest. What do you think, Abel?
Yeah, I mean, my history with this goes back a long way, and only recently did I actually start asking people what they expected the price was when they are clearly indicating that the price was problematic. And sometimes that happens more explicitly, so someone will actually say that, oh, that's a lot steeper than what I expected. And sometimes they will just very visibly like backtrack. So I used to do these like enrollment calls, or you could call them sales calls, I guess. And I stopped doing them because it burnt me out, because that's a funny story by itself. But the amount of people that didn't show up to these calls, and I booked them, I put them in my schedule and I was there. But also I had this conversation with a lot of people where they were surprised by the prices. And like you said, like our prices are, so maybe we don't want to say what they are exactly, but we can tell that the industry standard, like what the average kind of fitness coach will charge you fitness coach. So, a coach for any like your training and nutrition goals will be in the ballpark of like 200 USD. That's like very much the industry standard. So our prices are like, very way within that kind of average kind of rate. And some people were telling me numbers when I asked them what they expected, which were, some of them were absurd. Like it literally, an ebook costs more than that.
Yeah,
At
right.
times they were like, I expected it to be like $20 to $40. It's like, man, like honestly, at that point, I would rather do it for free. Like seriously. So that was surprising to me. And like you, I mean, my first coaching period was, I think I paid $250 for that. And that was at a time when I was not making any money. And I literally remember I was helping out on like construction sites and whatever, like carrying stuff, because I was just trying to collect the money for that. So that's how I paid for my first coaching kind of experience. And at that time already, I was valuing it a lot. So
yeah, I'm kind of surprised we get some of the comments like that, considering that we only really market to highly achieving millionaire and billionaire entrepreneurs. So, you wouldn't really expect that.
Yeah, exactly. Like my clients are people who make 6-7 figures a month, like, because that's who I feel most qualified helping. So,
Right.
So it's surprising to me. No, but yeah, I just find it interesting. And so maybe it's just useful for people to know that like 200 USD, give or take, that's like very much the average rate. And some people charge triple or, manyfold that amount. And Greg Doucette is a bit of an interesting example, because I think the reason he charges as much as he does is because he literally doesn't have to take on clients anymore, I think, to make a good living. So I think he just needs, I think he just needs some way to justify spending that time with someone.
Well, that's exactly kind of like what I was saying as well, not to the absurd degree for him. I mean, I keep mine, I think, at a very reasonable rate, but like Greg, I have no need to take on clients. I mean, I remember you almost being like surprised when we talked about that maybe like a month or so ago. But to me, it's like, I enjoy training people. I enjoy the conversations. I really enjoy the number of times I've seen somebody come to me and say, I'm skinny fat. I haven't had the results I expected. And we change some things. And I'm not saying I make them look like a god, but I make somebody who hasn't had progress in years progress again. And that's awesome, because I've experienced things like that myself. It's very rewarding and gratifying. But there's absolutely no need for me to coach people from a financial standpoint. And a lot of people know that for me, this whole fitness thing is kind of a closed loop, meaning that thing, like any money that comes from coaching or YouTube or anything like that, just goes back into the charities that I support with the podcast. So it's even less incentive in that sense. But yeah. Again, I don't want to, go too much into all that. It's an interesting topic that I don't really hear people, because everybody's kind of private about their fees and coaching and stuff like that. But I think, like you said, it might be good for people to have a general idea. And then when you see, and again, I don't know how you personally coach, but I know I've heard a lot of horror stories of where people say, oh, well, I just got a template, then they never responded to me, and then they never did X, Y, or Z. I mean, I talk to a lot of my clients several times a week. I mean, they'll text me. I have a personal relationship with these clients. So I'd actually say I probably charge almost too little at times, but it's fine given the reason for it. So Patrick asked, can you discuss hypertrophy as a result of strength training versus strength as a result of hypertrophy? So I kind of started off the last one. Do you want to delve into that?
So can you rephrase that? Like I was zoned out for 1 second.
So he basically was saying, the discussion of, does hypertrophy come as a result of strength training, or is it strength that comes as a result of hypertrophy?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can start off on it, but if you want, you can go on as well.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, for me, it's relatively clear cut at this point that strength is basically a combination of neural factors, so basically the skill of lifting, and then your morphology, so how much force your muscles can produce. And then that has a lot to do with just cross-sectional area. So a bigger muscle is a stronger muscle. So if you want to be super, super good at the bench press, then you will have to do a lot of bench pressing and you will get better at it over time. But if you want to have the type of strength where just randomly someone can present to you a strength feat. You're not used to the exercise, haven't practiced it a lot, and you want to be good at that, then that's mainly a size question. So I think it's more so the strength is a result of hypertrophy rather than hypertrophy being a result of strength, especially because we can see a lot of people that are super, super good at one specific lift, but not necessarily better at, or not necessarily that good at other lifts that are similar to that and are using similar muscle groups, but they just haven't practiced it as much. So.
Yeah, I mean, so for anybody who's really interested in diving deep into this, check out my podcast with Jeremy Leneke. We really dive into this, and he is probably one of the biggest advocates to say that they're almost not related, or that they're related, but that one is not causing the other, and that they're just increasing in tandem rather than one, like I said, causing the other one. For me, I think it depends on, do you want to get into mechanistic reasons here, or do you want to look at like the result? I mean, I think we can all agree that on average, somebody who is bigger is going to be stronger. Obviously, there are people who are smaller than somebody else who is also stronger than them. But for a given individual, almost universally, when they get bigger, they get stronger. Now, I will say, I believe that slightly less than I used to. I mean, in the past, it was always like that is the only difference. Now, I mean, certainly, like for a given individual, like I said, but certainly there are examples where somebody has gotten bigger, but they, at least as far as like one rep max and heavier weight training, they can no longer do that as much. I mean, I was just telling Abel the other day, back in college, I was maybe 184 pounds, I think is what I was looking at. And my arms were just shy of 15 inches. And I was lifting pretty much the weights that I'm lifting now. I look back and I was like, how, like, I don't lift super heavy anymore. I will do more high reps. When I say high reps, I mean like 10 plus, not like 30 plus. And I was incline benching like 225 for 8, and then going into incline dumbbell, 100-pound dumbbells for like 10. And I'm not saying like that's like crazy strong, but for a guy who, like I said, I was like 20 years old, 180-ish with 15-inch arms, I mean, that was pretty good. And for reference now, my arms are like 16 and a half or so. And, so clearly it's not just about that. And you could say, was that, just because I was so much younger and I've had so much time in the gym at this point? Was it just bulking up and cutting down several times? It's hard to really parse out exactly why that is. But in general, I am a fan of getting stronger. Now, where I think that there is a little bit of a mix up, and I've said this for years, is you've got some guys who, I can think of some specifically, who will say, you just have to get strong. Show me somebody who has a small chest who can bench press 315 for 10 or something like that. Just focus on getting strong. And the argument there, or that I would have against that, is like, yeah, no kidding, but how are you getting there is the problem. You can't just say, well, just lift heavy. That's the end goal. But a lot of times they'll say that in debate, or in contrast, like the volume crowd, they'll say, who cares about all this volume? Do you think doing, 135 for 50 reps is going to be helpful? No, you got to go really heavy and get stronger. But again, it's like, well, what if higher volume is what gets you to that area or to that level of strength faster? And a lot of studies do show that more volume will lead to more strength in that regard. So I do think there are differences. I think, as Abel said, there's a lot more that goes into strength than simply the size of the muscle. But I think rather than just saying, okay, we just need to get as strong as possible, it's like, well, what type of training is going to get there? And that might be some hypertrophy focused training, because it has been shown that a given cross-sectional area of a muscle has a certain force output. So if you increase the cross-sectional area of a muscle, in theory, you should have more force output.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add on top of that is that I think focusing on strength and having that mindset that I just want to get as strong as possible is a really good for a lot of people to avoid a lot of fuckery in the gym, because it's a very straightforward goal. And I think up to a pretty decent point, just focusing on that and basically nothing else will get you really good gains almost inevitably. And I think there will come a point somewhere along your kind of intermediate stage of being in your intermediate kind of stages, there will be a point where you will have to get a little bit more clever, and you will have to look at volume a bit more and programming. But up to that point, I think if people just focused on that, then it would prevent a lot of these, like, yeah, I've been doing this, whatever, I increased my volume here and I'm doing 20 sets, whereas last year I was only doing 15 sets and I'm still not bigger, I'm confused, that sort of stuff. But like you said, it like kind of runs out at a certain point. So if you focus on nothing else but getting stronger, then you can kind of start focusing on strength for the sake of focusing on strength. And that's a good way to plateau at a certain point. And I personally plateaued pretty fast. So I was doing a super minimalistic kind of workout split, and I was just trying to get stronger. And my bench plateaued at like 85 kilos or something for like 4 or 5 reps. And now I have like another, I don't know, like 40 kilos on it. Maybe not quite, but like got way stronger, but I had to get more clever along the way. So
yeah. And just one other thing I want to say, as far as like getting too tied up in the idea of like the strength is coming first, is, I have this problem still, but like when I'm dieting, let's say I do 225 for 10, right? Doesn't matter the exercise. And then the next week I get 9 with the same form. And I know I can get 10 if I push to all out failure. And I want to do that because inherently I'm like, well, no, if I still want to get 10, even if it's worse form, to like show myself that I haven't lost strength. But the reality is, and because I feel like by not losing strength, I won't lose muscle. But the reality is, if I've already hit that point of now 225 for 9 is as hard as 225 for 10 was the last time, the muscle loss is already there, assuming it's coming from muscle loss. Like, it's already happened. And by pushing even further beyond failure, let's say, or like right to the cusp of failure, now I'm in this dieting phase and I'm just impinging on recovery even further, which is one of the arguments to like just not always try to beat, or always try to like match like the intensity. I just think, and again, I still have this problem because I never want to regress, but it's just something to keep in mind that a lot of times the strength is the aftermath of the changes that have already occurred.
Yeah. And one way to make that even worse is when you say, okay, I regressed in strength, so I'm just going to do another set.
Right.
So I'm going to compensate, which
yeah.
I did a lot of times, but don't do that.
Right. Especially when cutting. So, all right. Next one was a discussion on minimum training dose and a concept of effective reps. So I'm assuming here when they say effective reps, they mean, Greg Nuckols has a really detailed article on this if you're interested. But basically that like I've seen people say the last 5 reps being what's really effective. And I've seen people just say like the last reps, the hardest reps. I think it's hard to say like the last 5 reps, because obviously that's going to be hugely dependent on the load that you're using. But I guess the overall point being that it's like those reps towards like the end with failure. His conclusion was that there's really not a lot of evidence for that. And I don't believe that you can really make it that simplified. To just say like these are the reps that count. I don't even really know if there's data to support that, not strong data at least. It's also not something that I really like. What are you doing with that information? You're still going to, one thing I guess that you could say is, well, that would be an indication for rest pause then, right?
Yeah.
Because you use that first set to get you towards those effective reps. And now each subsequent set, since you've only rested, 30 seconds or whatever it is, are all effective reps. I've seen an article, I guess by Berge, if I'm saying that right, on effective reps and his belief with myo reps. I've certainly seen some research on rest pause as well as drop sets to show, fine growth, but I don't think that's why myo reps and DC training and things like that work. I don't think that's why. I understand the concept. It might be why you can do less total reps. Like, for instance, I feel like my DC workouts are just as effective as regular workouts, even though it's less. So I guess in that sense, I'm in a way agreeing with it. You're having more hard reps. I just don't know if it makes a lot of sense to like get too into that, because it's obviously not going to be a specific rep number, like X number away from failure. And as far as the minimum training dose, obviously, by definition, if you want to use like the volume landmarks that Renaissance periodization uses, one of the reasons those landmarks are legitimate is like there's obviously by definition some dose that is going to be effective for you. There's going to be some minimum dose that becomes effective. And then the whole question, obviously, with their group is, is there a benefit from going from lower to high and all of that? But obviously there is some minimum training dose. And I think for most people, staying around that is fine. I am actually in favor generally of lower volume and higher intensity, not like super low volume, but I do try to find like, okay, what's the level that we have that works? Especially as I mentioned, like, I have a lot of clients who tell me that they haven't progressed in a long time. And I'll see some people come from other coaches or things, and I'll look at it and it's like, dude, like I'm not surprised you're not progressing. You're changing exercises constantly, you're adding volume. How are you gauging progress to begin with? And I do think there is value in having lower volume, again, closer to that minimum dose and progressing the intensity, at least until we get you progressing, and then we can focus on other factors.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree with pretty much all of that. And I think the effective reps concept is, so if you read Greg Knuckles' breakdown, then basically his take is that it's good in concept, but it's not as simple as only those last 5 reps are effective, because every rep leading up to that is going to contribute to some more marginal extent. But we cannot just draw that line that, okay, only from then it's going to become more effective. I think it makes a lot of sense kind of intuitively, because it's true that those last 5 reps are where the bar is going to slow down. Mm-hmm. So that's where you're like really exerting yourself. So that's probably at the point where you're really starting to recruit all of those muscle fibers and motor units that you want to recruit. So probably it makes sense from that perspective. But still, what's interesting to me, and what I want to figure out is, like, exactly what is the kind of best bang for your buck in terms of failure proximity? Because I would think that, like, up to the point where you're actually failing a rep, where I think we can make a lot of good arguments for, at that point you're producing or inducing a lot more fatigue, kind of disproportionately relative to the stimulus that you're getting out of it. But I would think that, like, approaching that point as much as possible and not quite reaching that point is still going to come with more stimulus. But then if you read Greg's article, then basically his message is that the studies all in all are like telling us a different message, that it doesn't even really matter whether you're leaving like 3 or 4 reps in the tank, or 2, or just 1. So I would want to see a bit more data on that, because like what seems to make sense logically to me doesn't really coincide with what the research says. And the rest pause thing is another thing that I would be super interested in, because, you know, there is this argument that longer rest periods between sets are better because you will get more reps or you can handle more weight. But I mean, if the muscles are fatigued and you're approaching failure, then shouldn't it be like just as effective, basically? So aren't we really talking about optimizing strength at that point and not more muscle growth, because muscles are responding to fatigue fundamentally? So I don't know. That's just some interesting stuff that I'm interested in. But I agree with everything you said, basically.
So I'll just jump right into the next one, which was discussion on neuroregulation of appetite and blander foods helping people eat less, which I think is, I always remember for some reason, like Mike Israetel talking about this like a year or 2 ago, when he talked about this kind of gradation of like, okay, you finish a diet and you start with like adding in the most bland foods so that you're not, and basically with the idea being that those foods, because you just finished dieting, are going to be really enjoyable still. And I mean, you even said that like when you diet down, you just want more of your healthy foods. And I definitely understand that. And then as you bulk up higher and higher, maybe you'll fit into more palatable foods. And again, I think that's definitely more like your experience, you said. And for me, I found it kind of the opposite in terms of what I wanted, where I understand that method. It makes perfect sense. But from a mental, like food focused standpoint, I kind of find the opposite, that when I'm dieted down and I'm really hungry, that is when I want all these cheat foods. And the thought of them is really enticing. Of like, oh my God, if I could have this, and like a cheat day. And maybe that was, you know, some of the bad habits I got into with cheat days, you know, years ago. Whereas when I'm bulking up, like right now, I'm sitting about 195. I'm eating more or less like what I want. There's really just not that same desire to cheat for me. You know, I mean, you know, Christmas is coming up. I'll eat some stuff then. But other than that, it's just food in general is much less of a big deal for me. So I don't care as much. But I definitely think if you're somebody who has a hard time regulating appetite, sticking with blander foods absolutely does help. And I know for a lot of people, this is why, and I hate to say this is why If It Fits You macros doesn't work for them, because obviously If It Fits You macros is just a concept and is meant to still have a lot of nutritious foods. But I guess the extreme end for people who are just trying to fit in a lot of junk food, I've had a lot of clients that doesn't really work for. Even it's just something like Halo Top, they just can't have in the house because they have one and they're like, wow, I want 3 more of these because it tastes really good. So I don't know if your experience is similar.
Yeah, and I mean, it's the difference between how you and I experience this is really fascinating to me, and I would love someone to tell us why that is the case. Although I recall us talking about this privately, and I think we got to a pretty good kind of common ground on that, so we might not be as different as what we thought at first. But like for me personally, what I experience is when I start dieting. So actually, even though the viewers might not be able to tell, but I've been slowly dieting for almost 3 months at this point. And I lost about like 6 kilos or so. But right now I have zero cravings basically for all the stuff that I ate before I started this. But in the first 1 or 2 weeks, I definitely had a lot more because I just switched over. So, fruits and things like that were a big step down in terms of the intensity of the taste and the palatability and all of that stuff, the texture. But now I'm so used to it. So I just like, okay, fine, this is good. And then when I'm starting to eat more, then just eating more, like I just get to a point where fruits, I don't enjoy them as much anymore. I'm just more and more bloated from them. So I need some more energy than stuff. And then when I eat that, it's like, oh, okay, so there are some better stuff up here. Okay, what more could I eat? And then that's how I slowly start kind of walking this hedonic treadmill. But yeah, I mean, as far as blender foods making it easier to diet, I mean, that's very simple. Like palatability is one of the factors that is regulating our appetite. So generally, we like eating more tasty foods, and we don't like eating not as tasty foods as much. So I think when I still used to have my Facebook group before my Facebook got disabled, someone phrased it really well, and it was, I think, as a sustainable strategy, eat a satiating diet. As a short-term strategy, eat a blend diet. And as a very, very short-term strategy, just starve. And I think that was so well phrased because, in general, I think you should be eating a diet which you enjoy, but the energy density is nicely managed. But like when you're really trying to dig, so if you're trying to get to a new kind of body fat level, which you've never hit before, or maybe just temporarily you want to be somewhere where you want to take a couple of pictures or for the beach or something, but it's not sustainable for you, then it can be a good strategy to just get into the mindset that food is fuel and I'm just going to be eating these foods, which I don't enjoy as much, but at least I'm not as hungry.
As you were talking, I just realized something that's kind of obvious, but I don't know if it was what we discussed in our private conversations, is that I don't think either of us are disagreeing with, like, I agree with you that less typically palatable foods become more and more enjoyable and desirable as you diet, right? Everything does because you get leaner, and vice versa on the way up. And I think you would agree with me that, if a junk food is, let's say, an 8 out of 10 when bulking up, it might be a 10 out of 10 when dieting because you're just so sensitive to anything like that. That's actually one of the reasons that I wouldn't say I disagreed with Mike, which I actually not disagreed at all. But there are times where actually right after a cut, I will like to have a really cheaty food because it's like that 10 out of 10 normally is like a 14 out of 10, just like this super hedonic pleasure that is just unbelievably good. However, I know myself and that I can get out of that pretty quickly. I can have that for a day or a meal and just go back. And a lot of people can't. So I'm definitely not saying that the average person should do that. I just like to personally do that. The other thing is just talking about habits. And touching into a different conversation, you don't like to do refeeds. I historically have implemented refeeds. That right there could be the whole answer, because if I was not doing refeeds, like we talked about, and like Menno doesn't like them because they get people used to those good foods again. So for me, it might be like, for you, it's like, okay, you're just gradually getting more and more hungry. So let's say an apple was a 5 out of 10. Now it's a 6 out of 10. Now it's a 7 out of 10. Now it's an 8 out of 10. But I'm still implementing refeeds with junk food. So for me, now that refeed that was an 8 out of 10 becomes a 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10, et cetera. And those become better and better. But by reference points, that, let's say, apple stays kind of bland because I'm constantly reminding myself how good these cheat foods are. And that's why when I say I get deep into a diet, it's like the idea of not having these foods anymore seems horrible because I'm getting this massive influx of dopamine every time I have them, to the point that I told you when I was finishing my diet and trying to implement those refeeds, I just like, I was like, this is just not a good way for me to do it because I was obsessing over those foods while staying hungry. So the big difference between our experiences could just be that I have historically implemented refeeds. And I would imagine that if I didn't implement a refeed, I would probably feel like you, that like, man, can I just get I'm just going to fill up on apples. I just use that because that's a fruit I have commonly, but whatever. And I think that could be the major difference that we're experiencing.
Yeah. Do you feel like that's because I think that's a very fair assessment, but do you feel like now saying that's actually a good argument against refeeds?
Even, no, I still think you're wrong about refeeds.
No, I wanted to say like potential, physiological reasons aside. So let's ignore that. Like maybe those are still there, but
yeah, no, totally. I do. Because I said like that's one of the things that I've come around more to in the last year or so, talking with you and hearing Abel, hearing Menno, is that I don't think, one, that they have as strong of a physiologic benefit as I used to think. I still think there are arguments for it, but not as much as I used to. Two, I'm very open to the idea that it's going to depend on the client and the individual. But three, psychologically, I've always liked that I could have those days, but the next time that I diet down, I might just not implement them because they kind of mess with me GI-wise, certainly like mentally. I do think that it's a good argument as to why it might be better not to, unless you need them.
Yeah.
And I just also wanted to comment that there are some studies showing that just giving smaller utensils or smaller plates will result in people eating less. So again, this is one of those things where there's so many strategies people use. And at the end of the day, it's like, no, it's like, it just comes down to if you're eating less calories. But for the average person who's not going to track calories, a lot of these things do matter. So is keto better? No. But for somebody who doesn't want to track calories, it might be better for that person. And one of these, other tricks and stuff, like I said, is just they've shown in, I think, a few studies now that just giving the same food on smaller plates and giving smaller utensils actually results in eating less too. So it's just kind of a little side thing.
Yeah, totally.
One other question here, and then we'll wrap up with a topic you and I have discussed. So the question is there a specific time frame for resetting your sleep schedule? So this was from Michael. This one was actually old. I just never really got to it. So basically the way I interpreted that is like, let's say you have to, like your schedule is off, your sleep schedule is off. Is it going to take like X amount of time? Is that individual? And I think maybe we can also discuss like some ways to get back into a normal sleep schedule.
Yeah, so I heard this number from, it might have been Menno, but might have been someone else, that basically every hour of a shift in your circadian rhythm takes roughly 1 day, which obviously is just a rough kind of ballpark. But if you want to reset your sleep schedule and like you want to start waking up at 2 hours earlier, then it will roughly take you 2 days. And that to me sort of makes sense because like, let's say, so like you've been sleeping in, you're living the life of a college student at, summer holiday or something. And then you were waking up at 11 a.m. and now you want to wake up at 9 a.m. Then, maybe you will go to bed a bit earlier. You won't be able to fall asleep. So, but you wake yourself up at 9 a.m., you will be sleepy and it will be easier for you to go to bed earlier the next day. And then, by the next day, you're getting close to where you want to be. So.
Yeah. I think that's a good general guideline. I think, for people who are familiar with CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapy, it's funny, I've mentioned CBT for sleep and people very understandably think I'm saying CBD. So no, not CBD, but CBT. And it's actually CBTi for insomnia. And the idea behind this, so to answer like the time frame, I don't have a specific time frame that it would take. Obviously, it's going to be somewhat individual, just as are you somebody who is more of a night owl versus early bird, and how your schedule. Like basically, what is your current schedule? What is your natural schedule like? And the discrepancy there is going to be somewhat individual. As far as the CBT, that is and has been shown to be more effective, especially long term, than sleep drugs. I'm not a fan of sleep drugs like Ambien. They have been shown to have deleterious effects. They have been shown to wane in effectiveness over time. So, other than some specific situations, that's not something I recommend. With the cognitive behavioral therapy, obviously, there are, the things that we all know, right? Don't be on technology with the blue lights and everything within a few hours of bed. Don't eat a big meal within a few hours of bed. Try to read. Don't use your bed for anything. It's funny because they say don't use your bed for anything besides sleep and sex, which to me, it's very clear that they're just including sex there because it's almost like well, you're going to do that.
It's unfair to ask.
Right. But really, that is it. Because otherwise, it's like sleep and this activity that gets your heart rate up and stimulates you and all these things. It's like obviously that association with the bed is going to counter the sleep effect. So if you really want it to be dedicated, like don't use your bed for that either. But for the most part, it just associates, as in don't do work in bed, don't be on your phone in bed, et cetera, which can be hard because I really like to like wind down in my bed on my phone. And so I'm not saying I do all of these perfectly. I definitely don't bring my laptop or anything. But sometimes I am on my phone. Reading gets me to fall asleep very quickly. So that's good. But two big things, and probably the biggest aspects of it that make it difficult are, one, you want to have the same sleep schedule pretty much every day if possible, with the more important aspect being when you wake up. So let's say you're, okay, I'm going to wake up at 5 a.m. every day. Even if you normally go to sleep from 9 to 5, even if now you're late and it's like 10 o'clock, you still keep it at 5, at least in the initial stages. And the other thing that's even harder, and this is why I've given people this advice and like almost nobody wants to do it because it's hard, is if you are in bed for more than 15 minutes without sleeping, you're supposed to get up and do something else until you fall asleep. Meaning that if you wake up at 3 a.m., and you can't fall asleep for 15 minutes, you are supposed to get up and read. And as anybody who's dieted knows, like that would be tough. Is because if you're waking up because of hunger, I mean, you're just not going to go back to sleep. I mean, it's very difficult. But the idea being that you will eventually become so tired and you start with, let's say you can sleep an interrupted 7 hours. You might only allow yourself 6 hours to begin with. Okay. So 10 to 4. And then once you are consistently getting those like 10 to 4, then you can say, okay, 10 to 4:15, and then 10 to 4:30. And eventually you'll hit a place because you might not be able to ever sleep a consistent, without waking up 8 hours. It might be 7:15, but better to get a consistent 7:15 than lie in bed and have an interrupted 8.5 hours every day where you're more groggy and you're not on a good schedule. So that's a really brief summary of CBTi, but it is and has been shown to be pretty effective.
Yeah, well, one thing I do sometimes, so if I wake up at 3 a.m. or something, I won't get out of bed because I'm just too tired, and I also don't want to create sort of a negative feedback loop, which might not be a risk. It's just in my head, but I'm thinking that from then on, if I wake up, then I would be like, fuck, I have to fall back asleep within like 15 minutes. Otherwise I have to get up. So and that creates extra stress, but maybe that's just like a fear that I have that's irrational. But what I do is when I go to bed and then I cannot fall asleep and my mind is racing too much, and eventually it gets into the even worse thing where I'm like waiting to fall asleep, and then that in and of itself stresses me out, and that prevents me from falling asleep, which is really frustrating. Then sometimes I get out of bed and I come to my computer and I like journal a little bit, just write down my thoughts and stuff. And then I go back and that often actually helps.
Yeah, I tend to not go on electronics, for the obvious reasons. But another thing I'll use is like Audible. Specifically, like there's certain people who obviously you gotta have somebody with like a soothing voice because I try to listen to some Audible books with like this nasally whiny voice. I'm just like, this is awful. But I don't ever get up and eat, even if I'm hungry, because then I do feel like, especially while I'm dieting, I do feel like I'm going to start training myself then to think, oh, well, if I just wake myself up, I'll be able to eat. So I don't do that. And regarding your comment about like, well, I'm going to have this negative feedback loop if I get up at 3, the idea being that like you will be tired. It's very normal for the first few weeks that you will be more tired. but you build up this sleep debt so that eventually it's like, okay, I'm so tired that now I can sleep through the night. And that might, like I said, only be 6 hours, not 8. But it's a pretty gradual process. I mean, this isn't something that like, oh, I'm going to implement it. That's why a lot of people don't do it. It's hard to push through those first few weeks. But again, generally, it's been shown to be pretty effective.
Yeah.
So to wrap up, let's discuss everybody's favorite topic, PEDs. But the concept that enhanced bodybuilders often lose touch with the reality of a natural lifter. And, just to clarify, this is in no way saying that we can't learn from people who are even like heavily enhanced. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think there are some people who are openly enhanced who are very intelligent and very helpful. But just the concept that over time, with years and years of gear use, you do see that some of the advice they give, it's almost as if they forgot what it was like to train naturally. So I have a lot of thoughts on that. I mean, do you want to go first or want me to?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, just because it's in my head, so kind of like it's dialed in because we've been talking about this a lot lately. But I think many times what happens is that someone was training naturally, and then somewhere along the way, and often still during the time when they were still making gains, they hopped on gear and then they started making even better gains. And maybe they started off with a more moderate dose. So it's not like their body weight and muscularity just jumped up incredibly fast. And it was super obvious that, okay, this is in no way replicatable by anybody else but someone
Right.
who's on gear. And so that they think that, okay, the drugs are helping somewhat, but not by that much. So from their perspective, it actually makes sense to say, yeah, I mean, drugs only help a little bit. So I think that is one thing. And the other thing is, I think just over time, it's conditioning. You get used to what seems to be working for you and what works for the people around you who might be also using gear. And then you forget that, okay, well, advice like you have to push the food. People don't make gains because they just cannot handle the burden of eating so much food. Well, I mean, it is true. I mean, I just spoke with Menno not that long ago. I had a consultation with him. And just at the end, as a kind of offhand comment, he mentioned that if he was not working with some gear users, he would never think that dreamer bulking is ever effective. But with them, he sees that, like they're eating, say, 4,000 calories. It's like, okay, let's add 500 more calories. And still no fat gain. Their body weight is still going up. It's like, fuck, let's try 500 more. And it still goes up even more. Fuck, okay, let's add another 500. And maybe there's a little bit of fat gain, but body weight is like still disproportionately going up. Yeah. So, that's enhanced reality. For like a natural, like regular lifter, if you just push the food, you're just gonna get fat. So, and it's easy to forget about these differences. So that's my short rant.
Yeah, it always reminds me of no, I should say always reminds me, but the podcast that we did with Hammer Away Fitness. And I was shocked when he said, well, would you go through, it was something like a year bulk if it could net you 3 pounds of muscle or 3 to 4 pounds, whatever it was. And that's when I realized like, oh, maybe I'm not clear to people that like, I would obviously do that. And that would be amazing if I could do that. Like when I say that I'm no longer like pushing the envelope with that, it's because I know from experience that I would get literally zero progress. And so back in 2015, I was like, all right, I've been lifting for 13 years at this point. Let me try to do like a final like big bulk. So over 2 years, I gained like 45 pounds, maybe 40 pounds, I'll say. And after I cut down after that, I netted like maybe 1 pound. So after 2 years, and like, you always say, what if you just spent those 2 years gradually trying to like improve your lifts rather than doing this mega bulk? And I just wanted to make sure that I didn't leave any stone unturned. Right. But that's why I just have no interest in doing it now, because it's like, okay. And that was years ago. So now, I mean, I'm approaching 30, like, if it didn't work at 25, it's not going to work at 30 after this many years. And it's fine. Like I'm not even complaining about it. It's just what it is. But I just have no desire to do, like you said, like to push the food. I know it's just going to be more and more fat gain. I have a few examples of this. I mean, some people who we know that we appreciate the advice from, like there's Jerry Ward, not sorry, Jerry Ward. Jerry Ward is somebody I'm going to use an example of, but like Mike Israetel, John Meadows, Scott Stevenson, all these guys are pretty open about what they do, and I think they're all great. But I can see examples like I've said this before about Mike Israetel's methods where, I think he's very intelligent. I think what he does is clearly working. I would, and no, we could never know the answer to this because I know he says, well, I use less gear than I used to, but it's almost like, there's a time component to gear. And so just because you drop the dose doesn't mean it's not going to work. Now, again, I don't know what he's taking out of those doses. I'm just saying, just in general, let's just say you took somebody who was like new to gear and you gave them 2 grams of testosterone, right? Like a really high dose especially for a beginner. They would be growing very quickly. And then he said, what, this is kind of crazy. Let's drop them down to 1 gram. They would continue for a while to grow. Obviously, we're talking about a certain amount of time here. They would continue to grow. And then they could say, wow, I'm bigger now on 1 gram than I was on 2 grams before. And it's like, yeah, that's true, but you've still been on gear this length of time. And I'm not saying that's exactly what's happening. Mike, I'm just giving an example with him. So I hate to like have that go back to him. He thinks I'm like talking crap, but just as an example. And so
Dr. Mike tagged in. Can you react to this?
Right. So when you have something like that, it just kind of muddies the water. I don't think it's as simple as saying, well, I use less than I used to. I think there is more to it than that. But I mentioned, I would say about Jerry Ward. So he's an example. So we're going to talk about 2 things. One, the disconnect. But first, I just want to say when people really can underestimate, and I just had a podcast that'll actually probably be released before this one with Cornelius Parkin. So that's coming out tomorrow. So, and we talk about being enhanced versus being natural. And he kind of laughed and he said, like, it's a joke for people to say it's like the icing on the cake. He competed, I think, 25 pounds heavier on stage after 3 years. Actually, you know what it was? So he competed, then he came off everything. So you could argue he still kept something and he still competed 25 pounds lighter than he was enhanced. And that was only after 3 years of being enhanced, not decades. And he even said that if he took more, he didn't even take that much. If he took more, he could have competed 40 or 50 pounds heavier. Right. So people have this idea. It's just so laughable to me when people say, oh, it's just the icing on the cake. And I give Jerry Ward as example because this was a guy. So if anybody's not familiar, he clearly had pretty good genetics. He talks about how when he was in high school, he was, I think, incline benching like 110-pound dumbbells for like 10 reps. Okay. For a high school kid, that's impressive. He won like a, teen competition, whatever. Then he went into years and years of high doses of steroids, growth hormone, insulin, a component called follistatin, which is a myostatin inhibitor. Okay, things that he has said he feels like he's changed his genetics forever. His base, forever, and yet he competed at 195. Okay, with all of that stuff, like when he was super enhanced, he competed at like 195. So that shows you that somebody with good genetics and normal height. Now, where I say he clearly has a disconnect with the reality of natural training is, he's come off the gear and now he'll sit at like a lean 195, but not a competition 195. And I remember him saying, no, you lose everything when you come off of it. And he said, when I started gear, I was 175. Now, 20 years later, I'm 195. You don't think I could have gained 1 pound of muscle per year during that time? To which we both said, no, obviously you couldn't continue to gain a pound of muscle after already lifting for a long time for 20 years. That's insane. I mean, that's just completely out of touch with reality. You're still on testosterone replacement therapy after years and years and years of tons of gear. You probably have a good 20 pounds more muscle than you otherwise would have, maybe 15. It's a significant amount. And one other example I'll give is, and everybody who's like listen to my podcast knows that I really like Scott Stevenson. He is one of a very small handful of people who I really hold in high regard in this space. But I remember we were talking one time and I said how I really had to push to get to a 225 overhead press. Like it was like took everything specialization phase. I mean, it was hard for me to do. And it was a goal I was very proud of. And we were talking about if there was even any possibility of me gaining more muscle. And he said, well, but like think about it. What if you really, I mean, you ate a lot and you just kept eating and you got up to a 225 for 10 overhead press. And then you cut back down, you'd have to have bigger shoulders at that point. To which I was just like, dude, like it took everything for me to get 225 for one rep. To take that, I don't care how much I eat. There is no way I could ever. I would question even if I like really abused gear, but without doing that, there's no way I could ever get to 225 for 10. To take a 1 rep max to a 10 rep max after 15 plus years of lifting is crazy. But in his mind, it's probably because he works with so many enhanced people and he knows so many enhanced people that sure, if I said, hey, over the next 3 years, I'm going to do a lot of blasts, I'm going to really go up to like 280. Well, then, yeah, it probably would be possible. But that's just, I think, a disconnect from somebody who's not saying I'm going to use a bunch of gear. I think that's just a good example of it.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing that they don't realize. So Scott Stevenson, who is the other one? Joe Bennett, the hypertrophy coach, and not to mention like Mike Israetel, John Meadows. I think all of these guys are doing a pretty good job with staying in touch with the reality of natural lifters. And, they are interacting with a lot of natural lifters, have some natural clients or at least customers. So they are familiar with how things are still. And of course, they remember from their natural years. But I think that's one component that they're missing out on is just the experience of hitting a wall and hitting it like really hard. So the experience of someone who has been training for 15 years like yourself, and certain things are just not going anywhere no matter what you do. So you try this, like you try higher volume, lower volume, and like things are just not happening anymore. And I think that's why if like Dave, if you got on gear now, and I was someone out there looking for a coach, the fact that you're on gear would not deter me from reaching out to you because like you're still familiar with how that experience is. But if someone has like especially good genetics and they're like somehow like somewhere along the way, like before truly maxing out on their potential, they get on gear, then I think they're not really in tune with how that experience really is. And then because if they were, they would never say things like, well, you did everything to get to 225 for one, do it for 10 times that amount of reps. Like
Right. Yeah, and it's honestly pretty rare. I mean, I know a lot of people who have used gear. I don't know many, and they definitely exist, but I don't know many who have trained naturally for like 15 years, been the same for like 5 of those years, and then went on gear. I mean, it definitely happens, but I think most of these guys started relatively young. They knew they had some potential. Things were slowing down, but never like stagnant for years on end. And then they took it. Again, there's definitely examples of that. You just don't see that a ton. And I think one way, again, some people say you should train differently. Some people say you shouldn't train differently. I think there are instances where you would train differently, especially if you're implementing other things like growth hormone and insulin. But it's almost like, we talked earlier about like us having different jobs, and I know a decent amount, as far as financial investing, but not, I'm not like an expert in it at all. And in a way, I can get by with poor judgment because I have a job that is funneling in a good amount of money, right? So I could really have kind of poor decision making and still come out on top financially because, this money that's siphoning in. But let's say I didn't make good money. I would really have to have like the best financial advice. I have to make sure I was doing everything exactly right to get on top. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. And in a similar way, if you are on high amounts of gear, you can do kind of just okay stuff. And you may still get way ahead of somebody who's doing everything perfectly, who doesn't have that advantage. I think it's like a reasonable analogy for it.
Yeah. I just thought of another analogy before, but didn't want to say it. It's like I don't know if some pickup artist guy who is like this super, super good looking dude is giving advice to you, like, hey, like looks don't matter. You just say these simple things and things are working out. And it's like,
Right.
well,
Yeah,
okay.
right. All right. So that is going to wrap up our first Q&A here. I do have some other questions we didn't get to, but I think there's a good amount of time. So if you have other questions that you want answered, like I said, comment down below, send me a DM. Obviously, you send Abel a DM, and I'll try to get to him. And Abel, where can people send you stuff or find more of your stuff?
SSD Abel on YouTube and on Instagram.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
Thank you.